Hi, it's Dr. Leslie Ellis here, and welcome to this initial module just to give you a general overview on what nightmares are, how they're clinically defined, and who tends to have nightmares. And in this module, we'll start to maybe tease apart when nightmares might be a normal expression of stress and adversity, and when they might be considered more of a clinical problem. So stay tuned. So nightmares are generally defined as vivid, memorable, extremely dysphoric dreams that wake you up. And this awakening criteria is not universally applied, but usually it's been used by researchers and clinicians to differentiate nightmares from more bad dreams. So kind of a less intense expression of the same thing. And it's a simple criteria to define nightmares. And I do tend to think that really bad dreams, the people that experience as nightmares, I do tend to count them as nightmares when I'm really, talking to people about their dream life. And one thing to know is that although fear and terror are generally associated with nightmares, and this is the predominant emotion for nightmares, really to qualify for this criteria, it can be really any negative emotion. So extreme sadness or disgust or anger, rage can be typical emotions that you'll find in nightmares. And so a lot of people have looked at the whole category of disturbed dreaming and see nightmares as on a continuum with bad dreams. So we really have to maybe not separate them completely, but to look at them as, to really get an overall picture of somebody's dream life and to count, if they're having, say, nightmares once a week, but then they're also having lots of bad dreams as well, that would be more significant than someone who just has a single nightmare, for example. Nightmares are usually accompanied by a physiological arousal. So when somebody wakes up from a nightmare, their heart will be pounding, they'll be sweating, there'll be a big fear response in the body, which differentiates nightmares from more normal dreaming, where there might be maybe dreaming about something that's quite intense or emotional, but there isn't a lot of physiological reaction. Something else to understand is the difference between nightmares and the parasomnias. Whenever I present about nightmares, I get lots of questions about the parasomnias, like sleep paralysis and night terrors. And because of that, I've actually put in separate modules specifically about these. So you'll find out more about their characteristics and what you can do about them in more detail. But I just wanted to just right up front say that, nightmares are not the sleep paralysis episode where a person wakes up, but they're feeling like they're pinned to their bed or sometimes held down by a weight on their chest or some sort of evil presence. Or sleep paralysis can also take the form of an out-of-body experience like the one depicted here. And these, as well as night terrors, tend to happen in the first half of the night, and they're accompanied by a kind of fog or a difficulty awakening, and so they really aren't the vivid, clear, memorable phenomena that nightmares are. So that clarity of recall as well as the time of night are the main differentiating factors. So parasomnias tend to happen in the first half of the night and nightmares in the second half when we have more concentrated REM and dream sleep. So who has nightmares? Well, everyone has nightmares. So it's really important to understand that nightmares, a certain amount of intense dreaming, is really normal. And when I talk about things like the link between nightmares and suicide, I don't want to cause an excess of alarm, although I do think that when somebody's already got suicidal ideation and extreme nightmare frequency, then yes, of course, you need to pay attention. But having a nightmare, especially when there's a lot of stress in someone's life, is a normal occurrence. And I think nightmares are actually a way of regulating emotion, as are all of our dreams. And so they're not always something to be concerned about, especially if you can understand why they're happening and point to something that the nightmares may be attempting to work out. And most of us have nightmares at least once per year, and depending on the study, it's between 2 and 6% of adults that experience nightmares every week. And a smaller number, but still significant, 3% of people in the general population will have clinically significant nightmares, meaning that they're occurring more like 3 times a week, and have an intensity that affects daytime functioning and mood and sleep quality. So women and children are affected more by nightmares, children in particular, and that is something that children tend to grow out of. So they don't really, they're not really a deep cause for concern unless they continue past the age of 10, or they're very extreme and disturbing and associated with other issues like anxiety and responses to trauma. So just a general sensitivity is linked with more nightmares. So certain personality types and highly sensitive, anxious people tend to have more disturbed dreaming. And then things like trauma, adversity, mental illness, all of these dramatically increase the propensity to have nightmares. And I'll talk a little bit about that more in the next slides. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about nightmares and sensitivity, because this particular trait is kind of a newer understanding of what might lead to nightmares. We do understand that, distress and just negative mood can predict nightmares, but there's also a few studies that are showing that there's also this type of person who's extremely sensitive that is more likely to experience nightmares than someone who's less sensitive. And so a 2017 study by Michelle Carr and Tori Nielsen came up with the differential sensitivity hypothesis of nightmares that proposes this novel trait found in nightmare sufferers is a marker for nightmare susceptibility. And in this trait, people have increased sensory processing sensitivity. So they have more of a reaction, both positive and negative, to some sort of stimulus that would bring about some kind of a feeling. So they're deep feelers and maybe more artistic and a little bit more reactive in both ways, positive and negative, to stimulation from their environment. And this fits well also with this idea from a very famous nightmare researcher named Ernest Hartman, who came up with the concept of thin boundaries as the kind of personality that would tend to have more nightmares. And what he means by this is more openness and artistic abilities, more vulnerable, fewer psychological defenses, so more neuroticism, as opposed to people who are more solid and defended. These artistic and sensitive types are more prone to nightmares. And then another study also looked at what makes people prone to nightmares. And yes, there's negative affect and psychological distress as major factors, but also they found that a dysregulation, so nervous system dysregulation or emotional dysregulation, so a tendency to get upset easily or to have a system that isn't easily settled, is also going to predispose somebody to having more nightmares. And so this forms a picture of a certain type of person that would be more likely to have nightmares in a given situation where nightmares might be might be at risk of, just becoming more frequent or chronic. So, of course, we all understand, and it's really well documented, the link between nightmares and traumatic experiencing. So, and what I'll describe later is how really that propensity for nightmares, a sensitivity, an easily disturbed nervous system, these kinds of things that might predispose you for nightmares, or if they're then met with traumatic experiencing, then these are probably very apt description of the people who tend to suffer from nightmares that are of clinical concern. Nightmares are, of course, a cardinal symptom of PTSD, and something like up to 90% of people with PTSD also experience clinically significant nightmares. And if you have already got a propensity for nightmares, then you're more likely to develop PTSD. And I'm going to, again, go into this in more detail, especially when I talk about nightmares as diagnostic, but that PTSD nightmares, trauma-related nightmares, tend to replay the trauma more concretely. So the dreams of those who've had a post-traumatic stress injury tend to have a little bit of a different quality in terms of what they look like in content and frequency and the physiological responses as well. They're a kind of a separate category. And they have been considered like trauma nightmares and so-called idiopathic nightmares that we don't really know the source of, but maybe are just sort of based on our propensity to be sensitive and easily upset. But we're also finding, and this is based on a study by Tori Nielsen, which I've mentioned in Nightmare Theories, but that early adversity can also increase susceptibility to nightmares. So that maybe the nightmares that we thought were just related to tendency to be fragile or easily upset or sensitive, maybe those sufferers actually are also experiencing trauma, and the trauma is what's led to the susceptibility. And early adversity isn't as well documented as later traumas, because things that happen to a person under the age of 3 aren't necessarily clearly recalled. And for the people around a very young child, things that the child experiences as traumatic may not is seen as traumatic by the people around the child. Things like parental absences, or even just birth of a sibling, or moving to a new country. Things that really can deeply upset a very young person. So trauma can take many forms, and there is a clear link between basically the degree of upset and its lasting impact, and the kinds of dreams that people tend to have. But of course, PTSD is not the only form of mental illness that is associated with nightmares. In fact, the general population, maybe 5% of us might experience weekly nightmares, but in the population that are being treated for some form of mental illness, it's more like 2/3 of people that experience frequent nightmares. And some of the diagnoses that nightmares are associated with, in addition to PTSD, are anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, borderline personality disorder, and really a lot of the anxiety disorders, social phobia, anything that creates this sort of activated, agitated nervous system, I think gets expressed in our dreams. Nightmares can also be a result of taking certain medications or stopping taking certain medications. For example, SSRIs are associated with an increase in nightmare frequency, especially at the beginning when somebody starts taking them. And if you are stop taking any sort of REM suppressant, so calming kinds of substances, including medications and things like alcohol. If you stop taking them regularly, then your dreams will rebound, and they can be quite intense initially when this happens. So there can be other causes of nightmares that are more related to substances, and that can be temporary. So what are the common denominators in all of this? Basically, what nightmare researchers have concluded is for there to be really significant nightmares that might be warrant clinical attention, it's a combination of a trait, a susceptibility, a particular kind of personality or sensitivity, or maybe early childhood adversity that has led somebody to have these traits. Plus a trigger, a traumatic incident, time of particular stress, any sort of major change, disruption, emotional event. So those combine to create really intense dreams that can wake you up. And things like the COVID pandemic, where everybody has been affected in different ways, and some people's lives have been completely disrupted, or their health has been affected, or they're treating people whose health has been affected. That kind of thing has led to much more intense dreaming and nightmares throughout the world. Major illnesses, dislocation, divorce, lots of things that, again, may not be considered a classic trauma, but are very emotionally disruptive or disturbing, can lead to nightmares. And these can be chronic or they can be episodic. People can experience nightmares as a result of something major and difficult happening in their lives, loss of a loved one, for example. And the nightmares can help process this and work through the intense emotion and help disperse the intense emotion. And then once the difficulty or the big dislocation or change or stress has passed, the nightmares themselves will also pass. And so a lot of times they do not become chronic, and it's mostly when they become chronic or the nightmares persist beyond the event that might have triggered them, then they might need to be treated specifically as a problem in themselves. But generally, I do want you to know that nightmares can be seen as a normal response to stress, and in part our body's way of working through stress and dispersing the charge. But they can also develop into a clinical problem that warrants specific treatment. And we'll be talking a lot more about this in the next modules coming up. Thank you.